At Pollsmoor Prison in the quiet hills overlooking Cape Town, thousands of men, women, and even children await the slow turning of justice's wheel. Designed to hold just over 4,300 people, the sprawling complex houses more than 7,000 souls on any given day, many awaiting trial, others serving sentences. Within its walls, hidden from the world's view, a complex social order known simply as the numbers shapes daily life, based on allegiances that reach far beyond the prison gates. Why has this place become both a symbol of South Africa's troubled past and a stark example of the challenges facing its justice system today? This documentary explores the real history and current realities of Pollsmoor Prison in South Africa. From its origins in the apartheid era to the modern pressures of overcrowding, gang influence, and reform efforts, we will examine verified events and facts. This story is told in a neutral, educational tone, focusing on systems, conditions, and human impact, not on sensationalizing crime or violence. We will investigate how Pollsmoor's overcrowded cells, powerful inmate organizations, and role in South African history reflect broader social issues. What we present is based on real, verified events and sources. The foundations of Pollsmoor. Pollsmoor Prison opened in 1964 in the Tokai area of Cape Town. Originally designed as a maximum security facility to house a few thousand inmates, it expanded over the decades to include 5 distinct units: an admission center, sections for juvenile and adult males, and a dedicated women's facility. However, the story of Pollsmoor is not just about bricks and bars. It is about the people who lived inside it, inmates, staff, and the wider society it reflects. During apartheid, Pollsmoor became part of the system that separated political prisoners from the rest of society. Among those held within its walls were some of South Africa's most important anti-apartheid leaders, including Nelson Mandela. Mandela, along with fellow activists such as Walter Sisulu and Ahmed Kathrada, was transferred here in the early 1980s after spending many years on another island prison. Their time at Pollsmoor would be pivotal in the negotiations that eventually led to political change in South Africa. Yet as the political landscape shifted, so too did the challenges inside the prison. Designed for 4,336 inmates, Pollsmoor regularly holds more than 7,000, sometimes closer to 8,000, people at a time. This overcrowding affects every aspect of life inside Pollsmoor, creating conditions that strain basic infrastructure, health services, and safety. It sets the stage for the social dynamics and day-to-day realities that we will explore in the next chapter. The numbers and unofficial order. Even before an inmate sets foot into a Pollsmoor cell, another system has already claimed influence inside the prison walls. South African prisons are known for the presence of tightly structured inmate groups called the Numbers, 3 main gangs known as the 20SIXS, 27s, and 28s. These groups exist not just within this one prison but across facilities throughout the country, with histories reaching back more than a century. In Pollsmoor, these gangs have established an informal yet powerful social order among inmates. The 20SIXS are often associated with securing goods and currency within the prison's internal economy, the 27s with enforcing rules and discipline, and the 28s with providing protection and manpower for collective tasks. Each group maintains its own hierarchy and roles that members are expected to uphold. The system is deeply embedded. Membership often begins soon after arrival, as newly admitted inmates are pressured to align with one of the groups. Over years or even decades, these affiliations shape a person's experience of prison life and, in some cases, their identity. Members often bear distinctive tattoos or marks that signal their rank and allegiance. The Numbers do more than provide structure. In many ways, they fill the gaps left by official administration. Inmates report that daily access to resources, from food and clothing to social interaction, is governed not by staff but by these groups. This unofficial order affects how prisoners are housed, how they move within communal spaces, and even how they protect themselves from threats inside. At times, this unofficial order has led to open conflict. Rivalries between factions have erupted into prolonged violence in prisons across the country. Pollsmoor has seen episodes where gang tensions resulted in serious incidents that overwhelmed staff and required extraordinary intervention. Yet despite these pressures, the system persists, a reflection of deeply rooted social and historical forces that extend beyond prison walls and into communities across South Africa. Overcrowding, the real prison inside the prison. By the time Pollsmoor became widely known across South Africa, it wasn't only because of who had been held there. It was because of what the prison had become. Pollsmoor was built to hold around 4,336 inmates. But for many years the real number inside has been far higher. In some periods, it has held more than 7,000 prisoners, creating extreme pressure on space, staff, and basic living conditions. And when a prison becomes too full, everything changes. Cells meant for a small number of people become shared by many more. Sleeping arrangements become improvised. Privacy disappears. Tension grows not because prisoners are naturally violent, but because overcrowding creates constant stress. This is the reality of Pollsmoor, a prison where the physical building is not large enough for the population it holds. And Pollsmoor is not alone. South Africa has struggled with overcrowding across many correctional facilities, but Pollsmoor has repeatedly been named as one of the clearest examples of the crisis. This overcrowding affects every part of the prison system. 1. Health becomes a daily emergency. When thousands of people are placed into tight spaces, health risks rise quickly. In Pollsmoor, outbreaks of illness have been reported over the years, including serious diseases linked to crowded living conditions. Medical care becomes difficult when there are too many inmates and too few healthcare staff. Even small problems can turn into serious situations. 2. The system slows down. One of the most important facts about Pollsmoor is that many inmates are not convicted criminals. A large number are awaiting trial. This means they are still legally presumed innocent, but they remain locked inside because the court system moves slowly, bail is unaffordable, or cases are delayed for months or even years. This creates a dangerous cycle. Courts are delayed. People wait longer. Cells fill up. Conditions worsen. Pressure increases. Violence and disorder become more likely. Pollsmoor becomes not just a prison, but a holding system for a justice system under strain. 3. Staff lose control of daily life. When prisons are overcrowded, staff numbers often stay the same. This means officers must supervise more inmates than they can realistically manage. And in that gap, informal systems grow stronger. The numbers gangs become more influential, because they can organize people faster than the official structure can. This is where the title begins to feel real. Pollsmoor becomes a place where official rules exist on paper. But the real control is often decided inside the cells. 4. A prison that reflects society. Pollsmoor is not just a prison story. It is also a mirror of South Africa's struggles with poverty, inequality, and crime. Many inmates come from communities where violence is already common, jobs are scarce, and survival often depends on belonging to a group. So when those individuals arrive at Pollsmoor, they don't enter a new world. They enter a continuation of the same world, just locked behind walls. And overcrowding turns that continuation into something even more intense. Because when you pack thousands of people into a space built for far fewer, you don't just create discomfort. You create a system where control, identity, and survival become more important than rehabilitation. And the longer the overcrowding continues, the more Pollsmoor begins to resemble something else entirely. Not a correctional facility, but a pressure chamber. And then the question becomes unavoidable. If Pollsmoor is already beyond its limits, what happens when the prison can no longer hold the weight of its own population? Because at Pollsmoor the walls are strong, but the system behind them is under constant strain. And in the next chapter, we uncover the moment when that strain reached a breaking point. When Pollsmoor became a national scandal. For years people outside Pollsmoor heard rumors. Overcrowding. Poor conditions. Gang influence. But for most of the public, Pollsmoor was still just a name on a map. Until the story started reaching the courts. And then Pollsmoor stopped being a prison problem. It became a national human rights issue. In South Africa, prisoners still have legal rights. They are still protected under the Constitution. And when conditions become extreme, courts can step in. Pollsmoor was one of the prisons that forced the country to face an uncomfortable truth. A prison can punish someone, but it is not supposed to destroy them. A system under legal pressure. Over time, reports began to describe serious problems inside Pollsmoor, especially in areas related to sanitation, access to medical treatment, overcrowding, safety and control. Human rights organizations and legal advocates began raising alarms. They argued that the conditions inside were no longer just difficult. They were becoming dangerous. In some cases, prisoners and lawyers claimed that the state was failing its duty to provide even basic care. And when the legal system starts asking questions, the government has to respond. The moment Pollsmoor entered global headlines. Pollsmoor's reputation spread beyond South Africa partly because of one major detail. This prison once held Nelson Mandela. That fact alone gave Pollsmoor a special weight in history. It was not just any prison. It was a place connected to South Africa's most important political transformation. So when modern reports began describing Pollsmoor as overcrowded, strained, and unstable, the contrast shocked many people. How could a prison linked to freedom and political change become a symbol of breakdown? The problem of waiting. One of the most disturbing realities revealed in discussions about Pollsmoor was how many inmates were not sentenced prisoners. Many were simply waiting. Waiting for trial. Waiting for court dates. Waiting for bail hearings. Waiting for the justice system to move. This meant Pollsmoor was not only punishing criminals. It was holding thousands of people in limbo. And the longer they waited, the more overcrowding increased. The prison became like a traffic jam that never clears. When overcrowding becomes a security threat, at a certain point, overcrowding stops being only a health issue. It becomes a security risk. Because when inmates outnumber staff by too much, the prison becomes harder to manage. Officers may struggle to control movement. Searches become less effective. Contraband becomes easier to hide. Gang influence becomes harder to stop. And inside Pollsmoor, where the numbers already held strong social power, overcrowding made the unofficial system even stronger. It created the perfect environment for underground control. Not because officers didn't care, but because the prison had grown too large for its own structure. A prison that began to fail its purpose. Pollsmoor was designed to serve three main goals: secure detention, punishment under law, rehabilitation. But with overcrowding and system pressure, rehabilitation became harder to achieve. Education programs, mental health support, and rehabilitation efforts struggle to work when the prison is overwhelmed. In this environment, many inmates don't leave better. They leave hardened, traumatized, or more connected to criminal networks than when they entered. And that creates a dangerous ripple effect. Because Pollsmoor does not stay inside its walls. Eventually, most inmates are released back into society. The question South Africa could not ignore. By this point, Pollsmoor had become more than a prison. It became a symbol of a justice system under strain. A place where too many people were trapped in delays. Too few resources were available. Gangs filled the space where order collapsed. And human rights became part of the debate. And as the pressure grew, the public began asking the same question again and again. If Pollsmoor cannot control its population, and cannot reduce its overcrowding, then who is truly running the prison? Because in the next chapter, we will look at the deeper truth behind Pollsmoor's nickname. A prison shaped not only by steel bars and locked doors, but by a hidden kingdom built on loyalty, hierarchy, and fear. The kingdom of numbers, and the hidden prison culture. Inside Pollsmoor, the official system is clear. There are wardens, officers, rules, schedules. But inmates who have survived long enough inside the prison often describe a different reality. A second system. One that is not written in law, but is enforced through loyalty, fear, and tradition. This is where the title becomes real. Pollsmoor is not just a prison. It is a kingdom. And its currency is numbers. The numbers are not a street gang. The numbers gangs are often misunderstood. Many people outside South Africa think they are just random prison gangs fighting over power. But the truth is more organized and more historical. The numbers have a structure that resembles an army. They have ranks, codes, rituals, roles. Rules that can last a lifetime. These groups have existed in South African prisons for generations, and their influence has spread across many correctional facilities. By the time an inmate enters Pollsmoor, the numbers are already waiting. Not physically at the gate, but socially inside the prison culture. The first days, when an inmate is most vulnerable. The most dangerous time in any prison is not always during a riot. It is the first few days. Because new inmates don't yet understand the invisible rules. They don't know who controls the cell block. They don't know who they can trust. They don't know how quickly a mistake can turn into a threat. In Pollsmoor, inmates have described the early period as a test. Not a legal test. A social one. A moment where prisoners are pressured to choose a side, even if they don't want to. Sometimes that pressure is subtle. Other times it is clear. Belong or become isolated. And in prison, isolation can be dangerous. A parallel government inside the cells. Overcrowding and weak infrastructure make prison gangs more powerful. When the state struggles to provide safety, inmates create their own system. And the numbers gangs fill that space. They create order, but it is not the kind of order society wants. In many cases, their influence can decide who gets protected, who gets bullied, who gets access to resources, who gets punished, who rises in status, who is pushed to the bottom. This is why Pollsmoor has been described by observers as a prison where the official rules exist, But the real control is often decided by inmate culture. Why the numbers survive. The number system has survived for one major reason. It offers identity. Many inmates arrive in Pollsmoor already broken by life outside. They come from neighborhoods where survival depends on toughness, loyalty, and belonging. When they enter prison, they don't suddenly become peaceful citizens. They become people looking for protection. The numbers provide a group, a purpose, a name, a structure, a sense of power in a place where most people feel powerless. And once a person becomes part of that system, leaving is not simple. Because prison gangs are not like casual friendships. They are like contracts. The prison becomes a school. One of the most troubling realities reported in South African prisons is that young inmates sometimes enter with minor charges and leave with stronger criminal connections. This is how prison becomes a training ground. Not because the prison wants that outcome, but because when gangs control social life, younger inmates learn quickly how to follow hierarchy, how to earn respect, how to survive conflict, how to build networks. Pollsmoor becomes more than a place of punishment. It becomes a place where criminal structures can grow. And when inmates are released, those connections do not disappear. They return to the streets. A kingdom built on silence. Perhaps the most powerful weapon inside Pollsmoor is not violence. It is silence. Many inmates do not speak openly to authorities. Not because they support gangs, but because speaking can bring consequences. This creates a culture where crimes and intimidation are hard to prove. Officers may suspect what is happening, but without witnesses, action becomes difficult. And that silence protects the unofficial kingdom. The question that terrifies every prison system. Pollsmoor is not the only prison facing this. But Pollsmoor became a symbol of it. Because if the numbers have a hierarchy stronger than the prison administration, then the prison is no longer fully controlled by the state. It is controlled by culture. And culture is harder to defeat than weapons. And this brings us to the most unsettling reality of all. If Pollsmoor is overcrowded, if the justice system is delayed, and if the numbers are deeply rooted, then what happens when thousands of inmates begin to believe the prison belongs to them? Because in the next chapter we will look at the real-world consequences of this hidden system, and the moments when Pollsmoor's control was pushed to its limits. When the system breaks, crisis, courts, and public outrage. For years Pollsmoor operated under pressure. Overcrowded cells, gang influence, slow court processes, limited medical care. But every prison has a limit. And Pollsmoor reached that limit more than once. Not in a single dramatic moment, but through a series of failures that piled up until the outside world could no longer ignore what was happening inside. Because Pollsmoor wasn't just struggling quietly. It was becoming a symbol of a correctional system in crisis. A prison that became too big to manage. As inmate numbers increased, Pollsmoor became harder to control. Staff were expected to monitor thousands of people, often with limited resources and high stress. And in that environment, even small problems could quickly become major incidents. When a prison is overcrowded, the system loses its ability to respond quickly. Movement becomes harder to manage. Searches become less effective. Tension spreads faster. Conflicts grow before they can be stopped. Pollsmoor became a place where control was constantly being tested. And when control is tested every day, something eventually gives way. The courts begin to ask questions. One of the most important parts of Pollsmoor's modern story is not what happened inside the cells, but what happened in the legal system outside the prison. Human rights groups, lawyers, and watchdog organizations began raising serious concerns about conditions in South African prisons. Pollsmoor was repeatedly mentioned as one of the most urgent examples, because the overcrowding was not temporary. It was ongoing. And as conditions worsened, the prison became linked to legal debates about whether the government was meeting its constitutional responsibility. South Africa's constitution is clear. Even prisoners must be treated with basic human dignity. And when a prison fails to provide safe and humane conditions, it becomes more than a management issue. It becomes a constitutional issue. The public hears about Pollsmoor's conditions. Pollsmoor began appearing in news reports and public discussions as a place where the state had lost control over basic standards. Reports and investigations described conditions that included overcrowded sleeping arrangements, sanitation concerns, shortages of medical support, rising tension inside sections of the prison. The image of Pollsmoor shifted. It was no longer seen only as a prison for dangerous offenders. It was seen as a place where thousands of people were being held in a system that could not handle them. The awaiting trial crisis returns. As attention grew, one fact continued to shock the public. Many of the people inside Pollsmoor were still awaiting trial. They were not yet convicted. Some were there because bail was too high. Others because their court cases were delayed again and again. This meant overcrowding was not only a prison problem. It was a justice system problem. And Pollsmoor became the final destination for that failure. When the courts slow down, the prison fills up. And when the prison fills up, the entire system becomes unstable. The real impact, rehabilitation, becomes impossible. Pollsmoor was meant to rehabilitate. But overcrowding changes the purpose of a prison. Instead of rehabilitation, the priority becomes survival. Education programs become harder to manage. Counseling becomes limited. Work opportunities shrink. Mental health issues increase. Inmates are not learning new skills. They are learning how to cope with pressure. And that creates a long-term consequence for society. Because when inmates leave prison without rehabilitation, the risk of reoffending increases. And the cycle continues. The state faces an uncomfortable truth. Pollsmoor forced the government to confront a question that every modern democracy eventually faces. Is prison meant to punish people? Or to break them? Because if a prison becomes overcrowded enough, it can stop functioning as a correctional facility. It becomes a warehouse. A place where people are stored, not helped. And once a prison becomes a warehouse, gangs grow stronger, mental health declines, and control becomes harder every year. The turning point. By this stage, Pollsmoor was no longer only a prison with problems. It had become a national symbol of failure. A prison linked to Mandela's history, now linked to modern crisis. A place that was supposed to represent justice, now representing delay, pressure, and disorder. And as the world watched South Africa's justice system struggle, the question became sharper. If Pollsmoor cannot be fixed, then what does that say about the future of South Africa's prisons? Because in the next chapter, we will examine one of the most important moments in Pollsmoor's history. When a prison designed to hold criminals and protect society became a place the public began to fear was no longer under control. Pollsmoor's legacy, a prison that changed South Africa. Pollsmoor Prison is not just a building. It is a symbol. For decades, it has stood outside Cape Town as one of South Africa's most well-known correctional facilities. But its real power comes from what it represents. Because Pollsmoor has held two very different kinds of prisoners. It held political leaders during apartheid, people who would later shape the future of the nation. And it has held thousands of ordinary inmates caught in the modern justice system, many of them poor, forgotten, and waiting for their cases to move forward. This is what makes Pollsmoor unique. It is a prison tied to history, and also tied to ongoing crisis. A place where the system is exposed. When people talk about Pollsmoor today, they rarely speak only about crime. They speak about the system behind crime. Because Pollsmoor reveals the chain reaction that happens when a justice system becomes overloaded. Courts delay cases. More people wait in custody. Prisons become overcrowded. Gangs gain influence. Rehabilitation collapses. Society suffers long-term consequences. Pollsmoor becomes the final stage of a larger national problem. Not because Pollsmoor created these issues, but because Pollsmoor shows what happens when they are ignored for too long. The kingdom of numbers still stands. The numbers gangs remain one of the most feared and complex prison phenomena in South Africa. Their presence inside Pollsmoor has shown how inmate culture can become stronger when the official system is stretched too thin. And when overcrowding becomes permanent, unofficial structures thrive. This is the kingdom of numbers. Not a kingdom with crowns, but a kingdom built from hierarchy, identity, and control inside a closed world. It is a reminder that prisons do not just hold people. They create environments that shape them. The big question, what is prison really for? Pollsmoor forces the public to face a difficult truth. If prisons are meant to rehabilitate, then overcrowding makes that almost impossible. If prisons are meant to protect society, then releasing inmates without rehabilitation can increase long-term crime. And if prisons are meant to deliver justice, then holding thousands of people awaiting trial for long periods raises serious ethical and legal questions. Pollsmoor shows that prison is not just punishment. It is policy. It is economics. It is politics. And it is a reflection of how society treats its most vulnerable citizens. A prison that reflects South Africa itself. Pollsmoor is not only a prison story. It is a South African story. It reflects inequality, poverty, violence in communities, limited resources, overcrowded courts, and the struggle between reform and reality. It is a place where the country's history and its modern challenges collide. And yet, people still walk out. Despite its reputation, Pollsmoor is not the end of the road for everyone. Many people leave Pollsmoor and rebuild their lives. Some return to their families. Some return to society with a second chance. Some never return again. But others come back. Because when rehabilitation is weak, and when support outside prison is limited, the cycle continues. Pollsmoor is not just where people are punished. For some, it becomes part of their identity. And that may be the darkest reality of all. Not the walls. Not the bars. But the idea that a prison can become normal. Final message. Pollsmoor Prison has been called many things over the years. A maximum security facility. A political prison. A symbol of apartheid. A modern overcrowding crisis. And for many inmates, a hidden kingdom ruled by numbers. But the real lesson of Pollsmoor is not about fear. It is about warning. Because Pollsmoor teaches us that when justice moves too slowly, prisons become overcrowded. When prisons become overcrowded, control becomes fragile. And when control becomes fragile, rehabilitation disappears. Pollsmoor is not only a story about inmates. It is a story about what happens when an entire system is pushed beyond its limits. And until the deeper problems are addressed, poverty, court delays, lack of rehabilitation and prison overcrowding, the legacy of Pollsmoor will remain a question South Africa cannot escape. Is the prison holding the people? Or is the system failing everyone? If you found this documentary educational, make sure to like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real prison story. And comment below, where are you watching from today?